Anyone who looks up at you from the bottom is going to go, what in the fuck are they smoking? So good. Hello, I am Mike Goes Boom. G'day, I'm Ash. Hope you're all doing fantastically well. Welcome yourselves back to War Thunder. Now, yesterday's video went off with a hitch, but today we're going to be talking about something a little more positive and a little more interesting per se. That is, what my predictions for War Thunder in 2021, or what War Thunder will bring in 2021. Now, I will say that majority of this is speculation and hearsay at this point. However, a source within Gaijin has given me some information, or at least a trickling of information, suggesting that the developers are looking particularly to split up the air and ground trees like they have with Naval and split it into World War II and then Korean War onwards, vice versa for ground and for air. Anyway, that is a side subject. It's probably something that we'll have to wait and see for, but that is one thing that I could see happening. How you'd balance that, I don't necessarily know. Would it be fair to have a blue water fleet and a coastal fleet, for example, and have that replicated for World War II aircraft, and then for, Korean War to present day aircraft? I'm not entirely sure, and balancing that would be a bit of a pain. So whether or not that is a good idea, I don't necessarily know. Apparently one developer was adamant that that was particularly going to happen, although on the forums they seem to reject the notion of that idea entirely. In fact, Smin 1080p has said on countless times that this probably will not be happening. Although knowing Gaijin, they've said no to battleships, they've said no to supersonic jets, they've said no to basically everything. At some point, you've got to just accept what it is and just think about what could be added. I've got a question for you. What do you think will be added this year for ground or for air, or for ships if you're into that kind of thing? In the background, you're going to be seeing some A7D gameplay for the whole entire video. Just don't mind me as I abuse people with something that shouldn't be 9.7. It probably should be 10.0. It's only because the ordnance, the airframe itself, is particularly poor. Moving on. My predictions for 2021 essentially boil down to quite a few numerous different additions. We had the Swedish ground a couple of patches ago, so maybe Swedish helicopters or maybe some Swedish naval. Now, I know the Swedish Navy was a little outdated, but they had a lot of vessels, so there's a potential there. Obviously, Swedish helicopters, I don't necessarily know too much about whether they used copy-paste or whether they, actually made their own helicopters. Obviously, then you could further go on to say, well, maybe some Chinese helicopters and Chinese naval, because they definitely had quite a lot of misfitting and borrowed technology. So whether or not they get Russian helicopters or Russian ships, or whether they get something else, is entirely probable in its own hindsight. Ideally, as someone who plays top-tier jets quite frequently, as I've only got 18 aircraft left to unlock, I really hope that we would see more chaffs and implementation of flares to different types of aircraft, and the addition of, or at least updating those particular aircraft that did actually use them. It's nice that most aircraft that get added have the ability to at least launch flares, or at least those of them that had them. But going back through the catalogue, it'd be interesting to see if you could go back and introduce some of those countermeasures to those aircraft that actually did use them. So that is something that I hope for 2021. Moving on, there's obviously the vehicles that were leaked a while ago, about 2 years ago now, which are still not in the game. Those include the KI-64, KA-74, the H-8K1, the H-8K4, the F-8A Crusader, the US version, the F-8E, the French Crusader, the DI-6, the IL-20, the Yak-25, the I-215, although I believe that's already in game, not entirely sure, the V100, the R10, the TU12, and the MDR2. Now, these were leaked in a separate video. I will just briefly show you what these vehicles look like. Essentially, some artist got in trouble for leaking some stuff, and that person had actually made those models, and some of those had come into game. For example, he was the user maker of the T2. So aside from those interesting prospects, what else could we possibly see? Well, continuing with the Air Force, or at least generally what is going on there. The addition of electronic countermeasures as well. There is no current countermeasure to radar aside from ground interference. ECMs will basically introduce a counter not just to radar but also to missiles. Now, to some extent, helicopters do have this ability, I believe. And obviously with a focus on more high-tier content, the well, the development cycle for that is probably only going to get more and more extreme as the year goes on. Essentially, we're entering the digital age of aircraft. In fact, we already have entered that particular era of 1980s to present day. So plane development really has to catch up. They have to add HUDs, they'll have to probably add dumbfire bombs of some kind, or at least proper laser and guided ordnance, or dumbfire ordnance as it's called, I believe. Obviously this kind of development leads towards the A-10 and MiG-23, MiG-25, Viggen even, or even aircraft such as the 1960s and 70s Pavia Tornado, for one nation, either Britain, Germany or Italy. Who knows? But it doesn't have to be all top tier focused. Hell, I'd love to see some more wacky French prototype jets as well. They seem to be pretty fantastic. I'll flash a few up on screen right now. Maybe we will see a Super Intendard with an Exocet missile. That way Argentina can have some representation within War Thunder. Speaking of Argentina, Kurt Tank also designed an aircraft for Argentina, so that could possibly come to game as well. What about Willie Messerschmitt's investment in Egypt, for example, with his Hispano HA-2000 and the Helwan HA-300, which was a supersonic light interceptor for Egypt. There's a heap of things, like a ton of different interesting aircraft. Unusually, Japan probably won't receive a damn thing. Now, there was a update towards the start of the New Year's where War Thunder Japan updated its folks, told us a little bit about what was going to happen and what they had hoped to happen in 2020. Unfortunately, they did specify that Chinese helicopters and so on and so forth were going to be added, but unfortunately, due to a certain thing that happened during the last year, that's not necessarily the case. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're probably going to say, yes, F-14, or, you know, maybe some other sort of F-15, F-16, etc., etc. Guys, hold off on that one just yet. I don't necessarily want to have AIM-120s and locking onto us in a broken ways. War Thunder already is broken as all damn hell. I don't want it to be more broken than it already is. We're certainly not ready for those kind of systems just yet. Although it would be nice. Everyone wants to relive their Top Gun moments, and I can't wait to see, you know, the beach scene and buzzing the tower, etc., etc. But those will have to wait for now. Obviously, I'd hope that they'd increase the battle rating to at least 11.7 or maybe 12.0. That way they can at least have a battle rating spread a little bit easier, considering there are things like, for example, the A7D wreaking absolutely havoc, as you can see here, with gun pods and AIM-9Js at 9.7. Obviously, the A-10 and Su-25, we still don't know how you'd balance them to an extent. I'd be surprised if we'd see AGMs extend out for jets to at least 10 kilometers at least. Maybe some guided bombs or weaponry. Maybe, hopefully, we might even see longer distance munitions. Now, my awareness about ground forces and what's happening to ground and naval is a bit limited in general, but for Germany we possibly could see a T-55A, T-55AM2, a T-72 and possibly even a T-90, although I'm not sure about that one in hindsight. Also, there is the Puma Model League with a bunch of interesting things as well. It's all possible that we could also see the Marder series of tank destroyers as well, and with that combined thing there is also suggestions, or at least from the Chinese server, that show different types of vehicles that could be coming to the German tech tree in the near future. Taking a look at some of War Thunder's competitors, that being Engage Entertainment's roster of being publisher, Crossout and obviously Cuisine Royale are now on the Epic Games store. You can find those readily available and you can play those games. So, is it a matter of time before we see War Thunder on the Epic Games store with a little Epic logo next to the name? And while I think that is a great way to diversify the market, at least when it comes to free-to-play games, I don't necessarily think that the addition of the Epic store for War Thunder will be a particularly welcome use, considering its effective, I guess, use or at least discrimination when it comes to players that are cheating playing War Thunder. And we know there are quite a few cheaters, but War Thunder's done a pretty alright job at trying to stop them at least. I say that, their anti-cheat is not exactly the greatest either. And if it's on Epic Games, well, you know there's going to be a bunch of new people coming towards and playing that particular game, just in reference to how other games launches have been on the Epic Games store. Honestly, I have a few disconcertions, or at least a few concerns here. Obviously, with the advent of more content, there could introduce a whole host of more problems, but what we have existing in-game is to be worked on too, so whether or not those fixes come through, whether or not we'll have a quality of life patch dedicated to fixing a few glitches in the system, and that will also trickle in, or at least sprinkle in, some of the user models, or at least the missions and files that have been included in the community development kit, which you can find a whole host of just different aircraft and vessels and so on and so forth, which haven't been implemented into War Thunder. Maybe we'll see some of those drip-fed to us over time. But there are a whole host of other things too, right? The existing map design, you know, glitches with the textures, sounds breaking, just general bug fixes in the hopes that, well, Hot Trash wasn't necessarily a good patch. New Power was supposed to be that massive quality of life, and while the clouds look fantastic and the new sparkling effects and everything look great, looking great doesn't necessarily fix a whole host of issues, does it? You can only polish a turd so far, and if 2020 was to go by with the addition of the Harrier at 9.3 and then its introduction to 9.7 and furthermore 10.0, I feel that there is only a few more lessons to be learned here that heeds a little bit of caution. Now, nothing against the game particularly, but still, it is interesting nonetheless. But with War Thunder comes endless possibilities, and unfortunately, War Thunder is a War Thunder problem. There are always going to be issues that need to be solved, regardless of how divided the player base is between 3 different game modes and one game mode they refuse to publish, that being Enduring Confrontation. I have no idea why it's just an event that's on rotation very rarely, because, honestly, I'd play that a lot more over the current Team Deathmatch that has been in the state of the game for the last 8 years. But yeah, I guess those old die-hard fans playing War Thunder aren't necessarily going to go away. However, if they're only playing 40 minutes a day, then that is a cause for concern. Gazan is acting on that quite clearly by shortening the match times in squadron battles and also in arcade battles as well. So it'd be interesting to see how 2021 develops, what kind of changes, and to see how the community reacts to some of the interesting things that might or might not happen. And while low tier may be extremely fun, once you've unlocked it, there is no real incentive to go back to playing those particular lower tiers, so hopefully in the future they do necessarily try to fix that, or at least help out those particular people who want to experience, you know, flying a Spitfire against a 109 for, you know, 20 minutes and feeling like a part of a battle rather than a singular person who has to fight not just his team, but all his allies. It's unfortunate that the way that War Thunder exists is by the addition of more and more content. It's unfortunate they can't just do a patch just to fix a lot of those existing issues that many players have problems with. For example, personally, I'd love to see some of the Axis minor nations go at it and have some aircraft, some tanks and some ships. But also I'd love to see some of the Eastern Balkans and maybe Argentina or possibly Brazil as well. There is a heap of just South American countries that could have some form of very interesting vehicles. I don't know what else. There's too much to go on. Let's just say that you should be optimistic for War Thunder's future. I don't think you should be negative about it. I do think that my last video did come off a little bit too negative on the tone of War Thunder as a War Thunder problem, but it did address some of the other core issues which I highly recommend you go and watch. Well, that's about it. That's my predictions from what might be happening in 2021. Let's hope that some of those guesses are correct. Otherwise, that's about it for this video. Thank you very much for watching. What do you think is coming to War Thunder in 2021? Anyway, cheerio.